This program is proudly brought to you by Daytech PNG Limited and Telecom Limited.
Good evening, Papua New Guinea. I'm Malcolm Wyra and welcome to another episode of Infocus. From suspended flights to drastic fuel rationings, the lack of fuel supply as a result of the dispute between the Bank of Papua New Guinea and Puma Energy has severely impacted the country. Given the timely intervention by the national government's 30-day emergency declaration, the situation is somewhat normalized. Joining us for discussions, we have the Managing Director for the National Energy Authority, Mr. Ronald Meketa, and the Minister for the Petroleum and Energy Ministry, Honorable Keranga, member for Sinesene Yangubul. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay. Firstly, Minister Koa, can you give us a brief rationale of around the 30-day declaration of emergency regarding the dispute between Puma Energy and Bank of Papua New Guinea?
Thank you. Let me firstly give you a little bit of background so our viewers can see the context into how all this thing will unfold. So as Minister, I'm responsible for Petroleum and Energy. These are two separate organizations. So the Petroleum comes under the Department of Petroleum and is administered by a secretary, David Manau. And on the energy side, it's a separate authority and it's administered by Mr. Ronald Meketa, who is here at the moment. So on the petroleum side, it's responsible for the production of raw material, oil and gas, from exploration to production to the refinery. And from there, the Energy Authority takes over. Energy Authority is primarily responsible for the distribution of the finished product. And they work on all related issues surrounding the supply of energy throughout Papua New Guinea. Whatever form it takes, it's their job to manage that between the supplier and the consumer. So these are two distinct roles and they're taken care of by two different departments. So Mr. Meketa here is here today because now we're going to be dealing with the distribution, availability or non-availability of fuel product, finished product, which is Jet A fuel that is supplied to aeroplanes. So if you ask me, coming to your question about the rationale, and give you a little bit more background. For jet fuel, there's only one supplier in Papua New Guinea, and that's Puma Energy. Jet fuel needs its own specific dedicated infrastructure. Its quality has to be always maintained because it's so important because it's used by aeroplane up there in the air. You cannot afford to have contaminated fuel. So from the ship, point of disembarkation, pipeline to the onshore tankerage, and then further transportation to the airports and into the aircraft, it's got to be protected. So it needs a very, very specialized, specific, dedicated infrastructure to handle that infrastructure. And in Papua New Guinea, only Puma has the infrastructure, both for Port Moresby, for Lae, and for Medang or WeWork, one of the two. And so they supply jet fuel. General fuel, which I would call it general fuel, that includes petrol, diesel, kerosene, oil. All of these are supplied into Papua New Guinea and distributed by a number of suppliers. So the importance of the declaration here is particularly focused on the supply of jet fuel to aviation, the aviation industry in Papua New Guinea. And because we have only one supplier, every time, for some reason, one reason or other, the supplier switches off the tap or the supply, all of a sudden, all air transportation in Papua New Guinea comes to a grinding halt. So in this instance, since the last 2 years or so, maybe, I don't know how far back, Puma, as the only supplier of aviation gas, has had these ongoing disputes about various issues about their documentation of importation and exportation with the Bank of Papua New Guinea. That dispute has been going for a while. On the other hand, Puma also had issues with its licensed banks where it had its operating accounts like Westpac, ANZ, BSP, Kina, all those banks. So Puma had a dual dispute, one on the one side with Bank of Papua New Guinea, on the other side with its bankers. That's been going on for a while. And then at some point in time in the past, both in December and January, December 2022 and January 2023, at the peak travel time for air transport throughout the country, Puma shut down fuel supply, and that caused a lot of civil disturbances. And somehow it was restored and it continued. And then it happened again in July this year. That is when it was felt that it was necessary to have a state of emergency declared. And that's how we are here. So the 30 days is running. Now we are on to the 16th or 17th day. So we have another 14 days running on the emergency declaration.
Mr. Meketa, I understand that in the past, if in the event that such situation occurred in the past, there wouldn't be the adequate mechanisms to intervene in this such crisis. Given the nature of your organization, which is the National Energy Authority, in what ways are you intervening in this particular matter?
National Energy Authority was recently created with the foresight of the current Pangu government and its coalition partners. We came into effect by legislation through the Parliament July 2021. So we've been in operation since 2021. And within the sections of the law, sort of give mandate for the authority to regulate the energy services, which includes the fuel services. So our minister was able to use that section to invoke the emergency.
Welcome back to Infocus. Now, Minister Ko, I understand this was an intervention by the National Security Council, as you mentioned in your press release. Which specific laws were invoked by the government to declare this 30-day emergency declaration?
Yes. So if this scenario happened before, suppose, let me switch to PG now. Suppose this was situation come up before 2021 by Nogat one specific legislation. Law government law invoke him, law try to manage him this crisis, because every time you shut him down aviation fuel and affect him travel blow, all get our passengers through Papua New Guinea. Now, Papua New Guinea, the people depend to a large extent on air transport because road connection, good plan the up Nogat road. Now big plus centers connected good one them road. Now shipping transport and taking long time to mass. So the quickest place from one point, transportation from one point to another, air transport. So Papua New Guinea, air transport is very important. So we have to maintain the air transportation. Also for cargo too. All the school supplies, the medicine supplies, and all of these that are of emergency nature have to be air freighted from one point to another. So when the suppliers, for whatever reason, all got all switch him off supply, blood jet fuel, go all balus now, all balus in apply now, all stop. Suppose you go to airports throughout Papua New Guinea, by look him, all get a man, all stuck, all get at airport terminals, and now cause him plenty upset throughout the population, and all plenty manually upset. All come long way through locks in balus, and then all come stuck. Law airport, they can't go for maybe 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, for so long as air transport them stop, all too stuck. So then that becomes a concern for the government. Government must maintain him normalcy at all times. So when there's a fuel shortage because of whatever reason, then it impacts upon the way we conduct our lives, impacts upon the way we do our businesses, then government must step in. So how MM step in? It must step in accordance with laws that it has available. And in this case, when it comes to fuel supply, relevant legislation only can invoke him National Energy Authority Act, na Essential Services Act, and tupla legislation is that. So what it does is that National Energy Authority Act give power of minister. Usati administer this legislation give him power of declaring state of emergency in a situation where you got fuel problem. And then once he does that, then by go pull him this Essential Services Act and by pull him come inside and use a lot of the powers that are set out in that act. So the two legislations work together, one for the declaration and one for access to the many powers that are set out in that other law. So when you combine it, it gives the minister plenty of wide powers to do what he has to do. Some of those powers include the ability of the minister to give orders or directions that people must comply with on pain of punishment if they don't. So everybody may deal with it down that track, but those are the two legislations that National Security Council have been invoking in the first instance. And after that, the matter came down to the National Executive Council. After the National Security Council only invoked him application law, National Energy Authority Act, Essential Services Act, MIPLA Department Authority, MIPLA developing one work plan, and then MIPLA set him out some directions that we should be issuing. Now MIPLA salim go back in law, National Executive Council, for the National Executive Council to endorse the work plan. Now endorse the draft directions, which was then done on July 27. So July 21st, National Security Council work a resolution law. July 27, NEC endorsed him a declaration plus work plan associated with it plus the directions. And that's when we had it gazetted on the 31st. But the actual declaration took effect on the date of the declaration, which is the 27th of July. So those are the two laws that we are invoking. We're working under that, and so far nobody has questioned, or at least on my observation, no one has challenged the validity of that declaration. Everybody's cooperating and we are working together.
Thank you, Minister Koa. We now go for a quick break. When we return, we discuss the 30-day emergency declaration. Welcome back to Infocus. Now, Minister, before we discuss the 30-day emergency declaration, I understand there are some specific penalties that will be imposed on parties that fail to comply with the directives issued by the government.
Declaration of a state of emergency is not done lightly. It's a very serious pronouncement by the government of the date. And when we declare such an emergency, then it also comes with the power to enforce the directions that are issued by the government. So in this instance, we'll come to it in a moment to go through the nature of the directions and work plans, etc., that we've published and announced and published. But there are penalties for those people who choose to refuse to comply with any directions that is issued during the state of emergency by the minister, which is myself. Then it becomes an offense under the relevant legislations, and it can attract penalties such as if you're a corporate entity, then you can attract fine of up to 500,000 kina. And if you're a natural person, then you can attract a fine of up to 100,000 kina or a term of imprisonment not exceeding 6 months. So if it becomes necessary in that remote scenario, people choose to ignore the directions of the government through its minister, then they can be prosecuted, and the courts can be asked to penalize them for their behavior or bad behavior. Because these sort of declarations are made in the national interest. It's made to maintain the quality of life of the people, maintain the state of health of the businesses that contribute to people's well-being, etc. So it is a serious issue. And when we are in such a state of emergency, people are expected to comply. And so far, it's worked out well. So we're not even thinking about invoking this sort of going down that pathway. Everybody's cooperating very well.
Okay. Ronald, to what extent is the disputing parties, to what extent have they been engaged in this discussion so far?
We have a very successful engagement so far. We are into our 17th day of the declaration. We have a roundtable between the state party and the Puma companies. We have a roundtable between the state party and the Bank of PNG as an independent body. They are governed by their own institutions and governance. All those meetings are chaired by our minister as the chair. And we are making progress looking at long-term solutions, sustainable and reliable, and we don't want to have that stop-start sort of relationship that we had in the last 18 months. Once the Forex interventions are given, we got Puma supplying. Then once BPNG is looking at other interventions, Forex is not only for Puma, it's for the country, for all the businesses that operates in Papua New Guinea. And so the challenge is having that Forex specifically for Puma for the full supply of the fuel for jet and diesel as well. So in the last meeting we had so far, we're making progress. We're looking at solutions, long-term solutions, back to back, or where we can bring in Forex from the extractive industry as well. We're seeking support there. And banks been working very collaboratively with the state team under the chairmanship of our good minister. Our minister has really worked tirelessly over the last 17 days. So we've seen some good results and progress made. And our solution is to find long-term solutions, not short-term sort of approaches we've been having.
Now, Minister, you mentioned there's a 30-day time frame for the emergency declaration. What steps have been taken so far, and what are the last final actions moving forward?
Yeah, so let me explain to you the background a little bit so you can understand the nature of the directions. The landscape we found ourselves in was a situation where Bank of Papua New Guinea was not satisfied with the documentation submitted for when applying for foreign exchange by Puma. And when that dispute continued, Puma felt that Bank of Papua New Guinea was denying it sufficient foreign exchange to maintain the importation of fuel to be supplied to Papua New Guinea. So that brought the Puma business to a stop. So when we declared the state of emergency, the first direction I issued was for Bank of Papua New Guinea to maintain the supply of foreign exchange to the licensed banks, all the licensed banks, Westpac, ANZ, BSP, Kina, all of them. The direction was to Bank of Papua New Guinea, you have to maintain sufficient supply to the banks. Don't reduce it. Maintain the supply enough for them to stay alive. Once that's the first part of the direction. Then the second part of the direction was, we told it was directed to Puma, that in exchange for the Bank of Papua New Guinea maintaining the supply of foreign exchange to you, you have to maintain the supply of fuel, particularly jet fuel, during the state of emergency. As we talk through all the issues between yourselves and other related issues, you have to maintain the supply of fuel. So those were the two core directions I issued right at the outset. And one thing that I should say by way of an explanation is this. Bank of Papua New Guinea is responsible for supply of foreign exchange, not directly to the importer or exporter, especially importers, but it can only supply to the licensed banks. It's up to the licensed banks to distribute it to those who need it, like Puma. So when Puma needs foreign exchange, it doesn't go to Bank of Papua New Guinea, it goes to BSP or Kina or Westpac or ANZ. And many other people also need that foreign exchange, they come to those banks too. So every month, those banks have the responsibility of distributing it to all those in need of it. And Puma, of course, gets its share from those licensed banks. They're also called authorized foreign exchange dealers. So they get the foreign exchange from the Bank of Papua New Guinea, they distribute it. So Bank of Papua New Guinea itself has no direct responsibility in allocating foreign exchange to a customer direct. Those customers, they deal with their bank, licensed banks. So that needs to be understood. So it's in the course of such distribution by the licensed banks that Puma feels that it's not getting enough. And that's where all the dispute comes out. Now, the directions that I've issued are intended to maintain foreign exchange supply from the central bank, and then Puma to maintain the fuel supply. But I've not issued any direction to the licensed banks to make sure that Puma gets all the available foreign exchange. That I can't do. Because if I do, then I will be pressurizing all the other customers of the bank who also needs foreign exchange. Some of them are involved in the importation of essential needs and wants of the country, like food, medicine, educational material, things like that. And we cannot deny them the foreign exchange. So the banks are given a lot of latitude, the licensed banks, a lot of latitude to decide for themselves how they distribute the foreign exchange that's made available to them monthly. Up to this point in time, we are told by Bank of Papua New Guinea, they make available about $100 million US to the banks. The banks then distribute it to all those who need it. And Puma is one of the major consumers of foreign exchange. So they take a big chunk of that from the hands of the licensed banks. Back to my two directions. Forex has been maintained. Fuel supply has been maintained, at least for the interim, for the duration of the emergency. And in our meeting last Thursday, or Monday this week, we have been assured by Puma that the fuel they have in the tanks is sufficient to keep them going for the next 30 days. So you see, we haven't got the final solution yet. We're working through it day by day, week by week, and making sure that as we work towards a final solution, that the fuel supply must be maintained. But the challenge we have is, what happens if the 30 days expire and we haven't got a final solution yet, and the state of emergency lapses, and then the minister at my department, my authority, we are no longer able to coordinate the supply of forex, the supply of fuel? What then happens? So that raises a question about whether the government has the power to extend the state of emergency, and that's an issue that the state solicitor is looking at the moment. So if we do not find lasting solutions to stabilize foreign exchange supply, fuel supply in Papua New Guinea, and it becomes necessary to extend the state of emergency, we'd like to do that, but then it will be based on legal advice, whether we have the power to extend it. So we will cross that bridge when we come to in the next few days.
Welcome back to Infocus. During your declaration, you mentioned that The emergency sets out to plan to investigate, among other issues, BPNG's 13 allegations against Puma Energy Limited and Puma Energy Refining Limited. Will there be designated government institutions like the National Energy Authority, or will there be an independent task force to investigate these allegations?
So one of the things that triggered the dispute between Bank of Papua New Guinea and Puma is that back in September 2022, Bank of Papua New Guinea administered 13 questions or allegations across to Puma to answer, and about questions that relate to the integrity of the documentation lodged with state authorities, such as at Customs and at Bank of Papua New Guinea in exchange for foreign exchange, and other related questions. So what the Bank of Papua New Guinea has done is to save those questions on Puma in September 2021. Puma has responded, but even up to now, they have not resolved those questions to the bank's satisfaction up to now. So what we're doing is we're using the opportunity presented by the emergency to try to encourage them to try to tick off as many of the 13 questions as possible, narrow it down to the remaining issues, and then we work out some work plan and focus on those remaining questions. So we will be having the work plan we've developed makes provision for several consultative meetings between all the parties, including Bank of South Pacific, Puma, Bank of Papua New Guinea, Customs, IRC, Treasury, New Guinea. Everybody's been brought to the round table, and we've had a series of meetings already, and we will continue to have those meetings. We narrow down the answers to those questions and try to stabilize Puma's business, if it is possible. If it is possible, we'd like to stabilize Puma's business in Papua New Guinea so that it can continue with its operation of fuel supply to the country that backs up our economy. And for Bank of Papua New Guinea to be satisfied with whatever Puma is doing and continue to support them with foreign exchange into the market. That is our long-term objective. So have we resolved any of the 13 questions up to this point in time? I think we will know in the next couple of days. Based on our work plan, we're having some final consultations today, tomorrow. So we should be able to get down to narrow down the questions that are outstanding.
Ronald, from the National Energy Authority's perspective, what recommendations will you be putting forward to the government moving forward to avoid such scenarios in the future?
We have identified certain gray areas in our existing legislations and regulations that we need to really frame up. And one of the recommendations or key resolutions that would be forthcoming from this declaration and all the challenges we have would be development of downstream refined petroleum regulations. So our refined products are regulated properly and licensed. So that's one of the key areas we'll be focusing on as the energy regulator. And of course, not only in the petroleum downstream byproducts, but on the LPGs and DMO as well.
I should also explain to our viewers that there are two different sources of threats to Puma's fuel supply into the country. The first one is from Bank of Papua New Guinea, originating from the 13 allegations that you've talked about now. But the other one, threat to Puma's business, comes from the banks, the licensed banks. Up to now, up to recently, Puma had 4 bank accounts, one with Kina Bank, the other one with ANZ, the other one with Westpac, and another, the larger one, with BSP. For reasons that we don't know, Westpac and ANZ have already closed Puma's accounts, so Puma can no longer do banking with ANZ and Westpac. But it continues to do business now with Kina and BSP. But the business with Kina is only on small volumes. For the big volumes of foreign exchange, Puma does that through BSP. So for reasons that we do not know at this stage, back in June, BSP has issued a notice to Puma of its intention to close the last remaining large account and no longer do business with Puma, provide banking services to Puma in this country. That notice has been issued by BSP to Puma and was running before the declaration of emergency was made. Only after the declaration of emergency did we become aware that there was a bigger threat coming from that notice. Because if BSP shut down Puma's bank accounts, Puma can't do business, and therefore it has to necessarily shut down all its businesses. And that means all the fuel supply is gone. So I think it was by divine providence that the government announced a declaration of emergency without knowing that there was a time ticking away on the 90-day notice issued by BSP to BSP across to Puma. So as soon as we became aware, we started talking to Puma because that 90-day notice was due to expire in about 8 or 9 September next month. And if that happens, all these problems will emerge, as I've just mentioned. So we had to call in BSP to a roundtable. We had consultations, and very, very fortunately, BSP has graciously agreed to extend that deadline from September 8 or 9 into March 2024. So they've given us an extension of 6 months from September. So now also we have some leeway within which to work, but the time is also ticking on that 6 months notice. Why is the BSP doing that? We don't know. Do we have the power to ask the questions as to why, or give directions for answers as to why they're doing that? Perhaps we do, perhaps we don't, but we don't feel we should do that because all banks have what they call correspondent banking relationship with other international banks with whom they can do international transactions. And a very high standard of integrity is required to maintain correspondent banking relationships. So if we interfered with Bank of South Pacific's ability to maintain the integrity of their own banking business here in Papua New Guinea, then other correspondent banks will shut down their relationship with Bank of Bank of South Pacific, and we have a bigger problem. So in trying to solve one, we'll be creating another very, very big problem. Because we need all those relationships, correspondent banking relationships, to be maintained by our licensed banks in order for us to have international reach. And we cannot afford to do that. So up to now, we have refrained from interfering with BSP's ability to administer its own standards on banking and raise whatever questions. So we haven't inquired into their grounds, and we choose to stay away from it. So we help protect their integrity and their correspondent bank relationship. So there's threats coming to Puma from two different directions. One from Bank of Papua New Guinea, one from BSP. We're managing both throughout this state of emergency, and also supporting Puma to stay alive. So it requires a lot of consultations. So our work plan, which you've referred to, makes provision for a lot of roundtables, both scheduled and not scheduled. Any consequential meetings that arise out of scheduled meetings, we have that also. So the managing director is established a secretariat that manages all those issues, and we're running it, around the clock every day.
Thank you, Minister. We now go for a quick break, but before we go, we'd like to thank Minister Honorable Keranga, Minister for Petroleum and Energy. Minister, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
When we return, we are joined by the Secretary for the Department of Petroleum and Energy, Mr. David Manau. Welcome back to Infocus. In this session, we are joined by the Secretary for the Department of Petroleum, Secretary David Manau. Secretary, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thanks for having me on board. MD, Minister.
Now, gentlemen, energy security is very important for any country in the world for strategic and economic reasons. What key reforms are your respective organizations undertaking to ensure energy security for PNG in the future? Perhaps we'll start with Secretary Manau.
Thank you, Malcolm. In order to answer your question in totality, let me step back and look at the department, the role it plays up until where National Energy Authority became an authority, and put it into perspective. The Department of Petroleum and Energy operates under a law called Oil and Gas Act. It basically operates licenses upstream, where we start off with exploration stages, where companies apply for licenses in the exploration stages. And as they progress and de-risk projects, the licenses, they then apply for next set of licenses, where need be they call PRLs, Petroleum Retention Licenses. And then they move projects into next stages, where we call petroleum development. And they apply for petroleum development licenses. That's where big investors that we have in country at the moment, like ExxonMobil, Santos, and Total, that are on stream now, will have these licenses to develop projects. In the Oil and Gas Act also, we have licenses under law where we issue for pipelines and also for facilities. But facilities license are issued within projects that are operated for exports at this stage. The only license for facility that's available that's working on commercial terms is the Puma license that they're doing a refinery business right now. In terms of energy security, we as a department in the past have looked at it in a total approach, where there's an energy wing under the department and a petroleum wing. So governments focus on energy security and energy projects in the country have put it in a position where it has moved a policy towards creating a National Energy Authority, which came into existence in 2021 as a law. So all energy policy moving forward in terms of security and downstream processing is now vested with the NEA. The department that we run basically focus on upstream down to production and then exports only.
Mr. Meketa, from your perspective as well, how is the National Energy Authority, to what extent is it ensuring that we have adequate supply of fuel or other forms of energy as well?
Thank you, Bal. National Energy Authority is the sole authority responsible for regulating all the energy activities, energy industry, and the electricity space as well. And more care has been given in the both sectors, and electricity is just a byproduct of energy products. So, in terms of energy security, you took at long-term supply, sustainable supply, production in country, and then the imports, the exports. Do we have storage to cover in terms of force majeure or sort of natural disaster? Is there enough storage to sustain Papua New Guinea for the next 6 to 12 months in the event that we are not getting any imports from outside coming in? Those are the very hard questions a government and the entity responsible we ask in terms, not in supply, but also when we are moving forward the energy transition from fuel-based, fossil fuel-based sort of economy to a renewable space, looking at our global alignment on carbon productions as well, emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So they're all sort of integrated from upstream, midstream to the downstream, and then refining, offloading, shipping. And most cases, the market is fluid. It's not dictated by any one agency or organization. It's all the international market indexes. So it's a lot of mechanics at work. So we focus on storage in country, supply, sustainable longevity, and that's where we encourage exploration for oil and gas. And if we can source more supply in terms of raw material from within country, that's security. Our oil productions from Kutubu has been declining for the last 20 years. When we started producing oil, we were doing 100,000 barrels a day. Now it's only 10,000 barrels from Kutubu oil field. So reminder of the crude from Heights condensate, which makes up our Kutubu blend, which is supplied to Puma, it's 70% condensate. So those are key serious energy supply questions we have, and we've been working in partnership with the Department of Petroleum, who regulates the upstream and the midstream business, the pipeline licensing, as well as our partners, ExxonMobil, Total. So we give them, look at how we can incentivize and look at increasing production from condensate and even from new oil fields if there are pockets available in the Papua Fault Belt. So those are all integrated. Now, 40% of our total diesel use for power generation by PNG Power, 40% is diesel based. So that's why they call them the C centers. And 60% is from hydro, which is renewable. So all the C centers are non-profit making centers, as classified by PNG Power, and all those big debates are been coming up in the social media and at the parliament as well. And our role is to move from diesel-based power generation or energy dependence to renewables. And we can do more export in terms of our export earnings can come in, bring in additional forex. Those are part and parcel of the security policy, energy transition, which we are putting together at a National Energy Authority as the energy responsible entity responsible. So we're still working on key specific policy, security policy, just transition, renewable policy, decarbonization of our energy infrastructures. Also, it insists on contributes towards the overall overarching national energy security plan.
Welcome back to Infocus. Are there specific projects on biofuel provisioning in the country as well?
We have the National Energy Policy overarching, which includes all sectors, both fuel-based and renewable-based. Now we're in the process of developing sector-specific, energy sector-specific. So we've got biofuel policy, hydro policy, solar policy, geothermal policy, wind policy, domestic market obligation policy. Domestic market obligation policy stem out from the 5% that's committed by PNG LNG through the agreements negotiated by Department of Petroleum, the Secretary Manau and the team, through the SNT and our minister who signs off on those agreements, and who can have access to those portion of gas that's allocated for domestic. Currently, it's specifically for power generation. We want to see if that can cover for downstream, further downstream processing, as well as on the condensates and other fluids. So those are some of the key subsector policies we're developing. We made those announcements last year when we had our fourth mining PNG Petroleum and Energy Conference hosted by Kumul Petroleum. We have the next session coming up in September, also sponsored by Kumul Petroleum in partnership with the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy. Our good Secretary Manau and the team will be there as well. We'll participate, give update on what are the policies specific we have been working on in terms of energy security, just transition, renewables, and decarbonization as well. So those are key regulations and policies we're developing. Now, just in the last parliament sitting, the current government is very supportive and understands the need and requirements of the country in terms of energy. So they have passed an amendment to the NEA Act that will give effect to the regulations that will regulate the off-grid centers and small power systems where you can use generators and side by side with solar. So during the day you can run on solar, during the night you can have the generator running, so it cuts down on your fuel costs. So PNG Power has rolled out that, and it works really well with the Samurai. They're considering the Daru as well. So those where you need the collaboration of all sector, whether public, private, and all MNCs, multinational corporations, to come together in support of government initiatives that are in place. So we think the current Maraberoso government, with the foresight we have those policies that we are driving, those are new policies and regulations. They're supposed to be done 30 years ago. We shouldn't have such issues. Now we see the need for it. So that's why this government is very serious about energy security. And our minister has been working very tirelessly to find long-term solutions, not just band-aid solutions, long-term solutions that give rise to this 30-day plan, action plan, and the emergency.
Now, Secretary Manau, are there some key reforms? What sort of key reforms will the department be embarking on in the next coming years?
What we may look at the level of the department is amendments to law to allow downstream processing, and also to look at facilities licensing where NEA and partners in terms of energy developments can apply for licenses and further develop our resources. So that's something we may look at and put into policy perspective for Minister to consider.
Thank you, gentlemen. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Infocus. Before we go, I'd like to thank our guests, Mr. Ronald Meketa, Managing Director for the National Energy Authority, and Secretary David Manau, Secretary for the Department of Petroleum and Energy. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bill.
On behalf of the entire Infocus team, thank you for joining us tonight, and do join us again next week Monday for another episode of Infocus. Until then, good night from us.
This program was proudly brought to you by Daytech PNG Limited and Telecom Limited.